I'll talk about one of those, which is onboarding. When you're bringing in new team members, onboarding has changed, I think, over time. It used to be just all about getting your laptop, getting your security clearances, maybe your badge, finding out where the bathrooms are, really mundane stuff. Today, smart companies understand that we need to make onboarding all about relationships.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Learning Unlocked. My name is Stuart Finn, and I have the privilege and pleasure of leading Open Sesame's global sales and customer success business. We measure ourselves by our ability to delight our customers in every interaction while delivering the world's leading marketplace for e-learning. Our vision is a world where everyone can easily access the training they need to advance their purpose. Even more specifically, our mission is helping companies develop the world's most productive and admired workforces. I am so excited for today's session with Rob Lauber. But before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. First, attendees are automatically muted. If you have a question, please share it with us in the Q&A section. We will be fielding questions throughout the session and will absolutely save time at the end to review them. Next, if we don't get to your question live today, join us on Twitter and LinkedIn using the hashtag LearningUnlocked2021 to continue the conversation. And finally, this session is being recorded and will be emailed to you in the next day or so. So please be on the lookout so you can share it with your friends and colleagues. So now let's move on to today's session. It is my privilege to introduce our guest, Rob Lauber. Rob has more than 30 years of experience. He brings a wealth of insights into today's challenges in improving workforce development. From 2014 to 2020, Rob was the Senior Vice President and Global Chief Learning Officer for McDonald's Corporation. And he was responsible for learning, talent development strategy, and execution across all 37,000 restaurants around the world. He's currently the founder of XLO Global, a consultancy and advisory business designed to drive strategic value for organizations and workforce development efforts. Welcome, Rob, and thank you so much for being here today. Let's get started with Learning Unlocked 2021.
Hi, everybody, and Stuart, thanks for that great intro and welcome. My name is Rob Lauber, as you heard, and I'm with, I started a little startup consultancy called XLO Global after I retired from being the Chief Learning Officer at McDonald's. Really excited to be with you here today to talk about learning and development and what's going on and what's next. Today, I'll probably have a lot more questions than answers, but I wanted to talk about what I'm seeing relative to what's happening in the environment. And so what I would say is there's sort of three categories that I've tried to bucket into the way the learning and development function is being challenged today. And that's in the context of the business model, so how we operate, infrastructure, so what tools and processes do we use, and then content, and the ever expanding demands for content, personalized content in the organization. So as you can see under business models, obviously preaching to the choir mostly here, but there's really been an elevated demand for the learning and development organization to play a strategic role in the post-pandemic world. And of course, through the pandemic, you all know, our need to turn on a dime and pivot very quickly to serve our audiences, in a very uncertain time has been critical. And I think a lot of organizations have now opened up their eyes to the importance of particularly on the content side, things like well-being, expert access, user-generated content, and of course, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as really being, strategic value drivers for businesses in keeping their employees engaged. So the big question for me on the business model is always, does the old model still work in terms of the way we run our learning and development functions? And that's probably the question that's being asked at the senior leader team, including your chief learning officers, most importantly. On the infrastructure side, it's been really interesting to watch. We've seen LMSs and LXPs continue to evolve. We've heard about AI, all those things before the pandemic. But with the lean now into digital transformation in organizations and really accelerated digital transformation on learning, because digital is not new in learning, right? We've been doing e-learning since at least I can remember 1991. So been around for a bit. But now big fundamental questions about the infrastructure that we have. What do we do about our classrooms? And what about these other technologies that are emerging in this space now? Things like virtual reality, augmented reality, workflow-based learning, easier said, workflow-based learning technologies that are coming into play. How are all those going to impact us as well? So what I thought I'd do today is just talk about a couple of areas, probably 3 or 4 areas where I can see what's going on and where things are, and try to back it up with some data and give you some food for thought on ways that you can think about your business model, infrastructure, and content as we go. The first of those is really hybrid work. And that's a word that's been used and is being thrown around a lot today. I think I heard Josh Bersin talking about it. You can probably Google it and find 100 articles in the last couple of weeks about it as well. So, and we're finding it means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and organizations. And what does hybrid work really mean, and what will it look like, is still pretty uncertain. So I'll show you a graph here just to give you an example of how the notion of hybrid work is really going to be sticking around. So the slide might be a little bit difficult. Hopefully you're on full screen to see. But the black line basically represents before the pandemic. So you can see what % of your full-time employees are working virtually or remotely at least 3 days a week. Before the pandemic was less than 10%, was 73% of the organizations out there. So, so you had about 27%, I guess, the organizations who had more than 10% of their population working virtually. But now you can look at the red line down below, where the expectation is, or actually the blue line down below, where the expectation is that 38% of the organizations expect that 40% of their employees will be working virtually going forward. So a huge shift, where that was probably 5% before the pandemic, 72% in the pandemic, and now 38% post-pandemic. So what can we expect? Obviously, we're hearing a lot of conversations about going back to the office, and organizations, and maybe your organizations, define what working rules are going to look like going forward. But you can tell it's going to contract a little bit as we go, and it's going to basically move forward. So obviously, organizations are open and more open to remote work than they were before. What I find really interesting is this survey as well from the Conference Board around willingness to hire virtual and remote employees. Pre-pandemic on the bottom, it was basically 3% of organizations said they were willing to hire somebody virtually. And that's that gray line on the bottom. Post-pandemic now, it's looking at like 25% are willing to hire 100% virtual anywhere in the US. I think that's really good for all of us, but it also presents new, it's good for us as workers in terms of flexibility and career mobility. In terms of moving isn't necessarily as prevalent as it has been before, but it creates new challenges for us as learning and development function as well in terms of what we do. And some of those implications are really going to be apparent to us as we begin to move into this environment. And so a couple of suggestions, as you'll see on this next slide, are really around looking at, if I can get to the next slide, let's see, there we go. Really, things that we need to lean into that are different for us. Earlier, I talked about the infrastructure and the technology platforms that are emerging. You can see more and more collaborative platforms are playing a role in the pandemic and will continue to play a role post-pandemic. So Teams, Slack, Workplace, Zoom, all these different tools that we have now for real-time collaboration, real-time communications, even real-time learning, the lines are getting blended between work tools and learning tools. So we need to think about, how do we lean into those tools? How do we use those and apply those in our workplace? And how do we step back from maybe our more traditional model around how we deliver learning and think about those platforms as they come? You're going to see more, in these spaces, particularly with these particular tools that I mentioned here. For example, Microsoft's talked about Viva, their Viva product launching next year, which will be an extension off of Teams. That's going to drive even more integration into those sort of organizational collaboration tools that have historically been around there, and continue to further change the way we think about learning and development and the way our operating model works from an L&D perspective. The other thing we should be thinking about is exploring hybrid tools. I just ran across a company called Scale, for example, that basically takes a model of a breakout session, where you pair up with somebody in a classroom model and does it through an app, and pairs people up in a virtual session, and you can have a conversation with them, and it's guided questions and timed. Some really interesting hybrid tools that are out there that'll help us sort of create that kind of some of those classroom dynamics that we couldn't, that we might not be able to create when half of our people are virtual and half of them are in a classroom. There's some new tools coming out that we should be paying attention to that can really help us and facilitate that. So a huge amount of startup, I would say, work going on, and a lot of investment going on in the startup community around being able to solve for these types of tools, particularly on the workplace learning side. Third, we need to think about new skills for our facilitators. So how does it work when, I have 7 people in a room and 13 people online, and I'm trying to deliver what was a traditional classroom session? That's definitely going to require some new skills. I think, we got the baptism by fire in the last year where we were forced online, and everybody had to do that. And we evolved probably in our betterness of it and how good we were at it as we go. But now it'll be, an adaptation of being 100% virtual and being 100% in a classroom. You're going to be somewhere in the middle. Again, a new set of skills required for the folks that are facilitating these sessions, and really how do they unlock learning in an environment where not everyone's in the same place and where some are in a group and others are not. And how do you keep particularly engagement going for both groups without alienating each other? And then I think the last thing to think about from an implications perspective of hybrid work is how do we make the learner experience simpler and more valuable? So you've heard and seen conversations around personalization and those types of pieces. I think that that's really going to become key as we go forward, and simplifying it, particularly as all these new workplace tools come into place. How do we do that where we're not adding 7 new technology tools for the way we do things? How do we, at the same time, adapt new processes, adapt new business models, yet at the same time keep it simpler for the learner? And I think that's probably at the epicenter of the infrastructure challenge that we're going to face as learning and development professionals as we go. So the second area I wanted to talk about as well was specifically virtual reality. And as we go to the next slide here, I just basically have a statement that says virtual reality is going mainstream. And just a little bit of sort of evidence for it on the next slide. If you look at the investment community and how they're investing into virtual reality and their estimates on the marketplace and what they're seeing, the bottom left is 2021, where it's about $30.7 million in terms of investment, in terms of revenue, so very small. But moving into 2024, there's an expectation that it's going to be basically a $31 billion business in 2024. So there's an anticipation that the virtual reality market is really going to grow exponentially coming into the next few years and in the post-pandemic world as one of those infrastructure tools that are going to be critical for all organizations to have. And I'll give you a couple of examples on this next slide, you will find that leading companies are actually already embracing the idea of leveraging virtual reality. You can go out and these are somewhat easy. The Walmart case is very easy to find if you're looking for an example. But Walmart's already partnered with a virtual reality company called Striver, and they've deployed more than 10,000, I want to say probably 15,000 virtual reality headsets with about 30 or 40 courses on them to every Walmart location in the U.S. And they're covering things like soft skills and technical skills as well. And I think that that's what's really going to be important. Bank of America is another good example that's also just getting started on that front and talking very openly about how they're going to deploy it in all of their locations as well. And they're really using it for a variety of different situations. So it's not just about learning a technical skill or a dangerous skill or those types of things. It's also about soft skills. So areas like empathy and communications and customer service, particularly as we're putting an emphasis on diversity and inclusion, how does that show up in the customer experience? These companies are finding that virtual reality is a great way to demonstrate how it should show up and for people to safely practice those types of experiences. Simulations, which are certainly not a new idea, right? If any of you have kids that are, or any of you are gamers out there, this is not a new idea, but bringing the simulations into the workplace is kind of a big idea. So how do you create skill practices and scenario-based learning for people in a very simulated environment where they can learn from it? And there's some good Walmart examples that you can find out on the web of how they're doing that as well. And then the third one's around procedural practice, which is really how do you help people begin to build mastery on repetitive tasks early before they actually have to do it. So in McDonald's where I work, for example, this would be how do you build mastery on making French fries without actually experimenting on making French fries, right? And not using the customer as kind of the recipient of your mastery building abilities or your workers' mastery building abilities. So thinking about virtual reality is really something to think about in terms of going mainstream and really should become part of the portfolio of our infrastructure as we go forward. One other thing to think about is, the investment costs have always been a big barrier to this as well. And this is, again, another eye chart, but essentially, and we all know, electronic costs the cost for electronic goods and services declines over time. The cost of technology declines over time. So that $3,000 Oculus headset 5 years ago is now about, $299 and will continue to decline as it goes. And I think that'll really help all of us on the learning and development front if we are trying to get into this game and are thinking about how we can move forward in a virtual reality environment and really build great use cases for it. This will really help us on the business case side, because as these products begin to scale, the cost of them is going to become coming down, as well as the cost to develop the virtual reality experiences as well. Those costs are already coming down accordingly. So expect that the costs should be coming down, which is great. The usage should be going up, which will be on all of us. But the accessibility and sort of the business case necessity for it, particularly in a hybrid world, is something that we should be thinking about and focusing on. A few things to think about there in terms of things to consider as we go forward. If you are thinking about moving into a virtual reality environment, critical piece up front is partnering with your IT organization early, right? The underlying infrastructure of bandwidth needs and device management and those security are all prevalent in headsets as they are in laptops and mobile devices. So partnering with your IT organization early really becomes a critical piece and an important part of what you're trying to do. Think about starting small and building out bigger. So, small meaning having a solid use case scenario that'll have the biggest impact potential. So Verizon Communications, for example, started with, a workplace shooting, basically, scenario, and said, we're worried about risk in our environment, and building a virtual reality environment where we can simulate this and it's a single use case, and help prepare people for that type of situation that they hope actually never happens, but want people to know what to do if it does, was a big use case for them. And was very impactful. So they saw preparation, confidence in people's preparation go from like 10% to 90+% now in those pieces. So I think that's really important around starting small with a solid use case that's going to have a big impact. And then I think you iterate and improve based on learner feedback. The Walmart model started with a started with the Black Friday scenario. So a heavy shopping day, what should I be doing when I'm out on the floor? How do I know which customers need help, which ones don't? Those types of pieces because of all the seasonal hiring that they did. They started with that. Now they have 30 to 40 different types of courses in the program, which is further driving the cost benefit scenario to be even better for them in terms of the investment. The other thing is around capturing data. Make sure you can capture your data and understand what data you can capture. In a virtual reality environment, it's a little bit different because you can capture behavioral reaction data, those types of things that are not the types of things we normally capture. And then, I think those types of pieces are really important that we should be thinking about as well. So, summarizing that, I think virtual reality is here to stay. It's probably going to grow. There's a lot of people already experimenting with it. You can see some really large scale deployments happening already. So reflect on how that might work in your organization as well, as something you should probably pay attention to in 2021 as an idea or something you can experiment with. And then move forward into moving forward into the organization, really figuring out your best business case for making that happen. So the third area I wanted to talk about is really, it's almost a catch-all, but it's a pretty big bucket, and that is upskilling and reskilling are top of mind for everyone. And what I mean by that, and I'll give you some simple examples on this next one, is that the pandemic's really accelerated supply and demand. I think some job growth numbers came out this week, added 366,000 jobs. Last month, those types of things. So you're continuing to see the supply-demand piece be in the news in terms of talent. So 42% of the companies stepped up their upskilling and reskilling efforts after the outbreak. And 42% of employees actually pursued training on their own after the coronavirus outbreak. So I'm sure we all felt that from a learning and development perspective. I think that's the evidence of elevated strategic value that we should be paying attention to. You can see the other two stats around 68 and 65% of the organizations are investing in upskilling and reskilling efforts. What's really interesting about that is on the next slide, I'll show you, and this is a conference board, talked about satisfaction, did a survey about 400 companies on satisfaction with particular elements of company policy related components. And unfortunately, learning and development of educational job training programs of all the categories they measured had the biggest decline in 2021 of any category they measured. So I think that's really interesting for us, and it's probably proportional to the organization's, increased need for strategically valued content. And upskilling and reskilling opportunities for the business. So certainly an opportunity for us where more demand's being placed on us, and the perception is that we're not necessarily meeting the demand at this point in 2021, in 2020, in terms of where we go. So seeing the biggest point decline is not really where we'd want to be from an L&D perspective, and go from there. I'll also talk about upskilling and in this next slide here, where we can talk about how it's near the top of CEOs' concerns. So this is a really interesting slide, which again, unfortunately, I'm not sure how readable it is, but the CEO magazine and CHRO partnership study was done. It was CEO magazine and SHRM did a study, and they asked the same questions of CHROs and CEOs about these particular categories like DE&I, leadership transitions, wages, those types of things, and said, where do you think people should be spending their time? And interestingly enough, talent retention and upskilling and talent availability and recruiting are the two biggest areas that the CEO population said that they think their CHROs should be spending their time and attention on. Although you can see on talent availability and recruiting, there's a pretty big gap between the CHRO's point of view on that and the CEO's point of view on that. As you can see on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is the first pillar on the left side, where the CHRO thinks that's much bigger in terms of time and attention than the CEO thinks in terms of time and attention. Right now, to clarify that, no one's saying it's not important. but they're talking about what's most important in terms of where they're putting their priorities and where they're putting their level of effort and what concerns the CEO. So talent retention and upskilling has got to be foundational to their ability to run their business, to run your organization, and to move it forward. So you can see it's equally top of mind for CHROs and CEOs. So something to pay attention to then as well, because your leadership teams in your organizations are looking at it as well. And then this last slide, which is a little bit squirrely, but I'll show it to you anyway, is that unemployment rates, while they stay elevated, although been coming down quite significantly, qualified workers are still hard to find. So you can see the black line is really the unemployment rate axis. So you can see it's dropping down pretty significantly towards the 5 there. But the percentage of firms with positions not able to fill right now, which is that blue line, is directly skyrocketing in the opposite direction. So you can see that it's passing 15%. Of organizations can't find the people that they're looking for. And that's essentially at an all-time high. In terms of, going all the way back to 1985, it's never been higher. So the challenge to find talent has been really hard. So the move towards upskilling is really about how do I take the talent that I have and how am I able to move them more around the organization? All of that becomes real, learning and development becomes at the center of all of that as well. And then I've got one more that I'll show you here as well. And that's really just around, the percentage of firms with unfilled job openings. So it doesn't apply equally, right? So the 15% is 15%, but it doesn't apply equally to all industries. So depending on what industry you're in, this more or less resonates with you. So if you're in construction business, for example, the percentage of firms with at least one unfilled job opening in April is 60%. So you can think about how much, or transportation, trucking. I think there's almost 1 million open trucking jobs right now in the United States. It's really astronomical challenges for organizations to be able to fill those jobs, even though unemployment's been coming down, and people have been moving back into jobs pretty well. But manufacturing, retail, you can see all the way down, and then financial services even is at 22% of firms are having trouble filling jobs and having at least one critical job open right now. So really important and exacerbated for us. Some of the implications are really, pretty obvious, I think, for all of us as learning and development leaders and as folks in a learning and development organization. And I think the first one is expect more pressure for us to have an upskill, reskill strategy that aligns with where the business needs to go. So if you can't find the people that you have in the marketplace, how do you teach the people inside your business to be able to close those gaps? I think that's going to become a really prevalent question that we're going to need to answer as learning and development professionals and look at where things are going. I think the other thing we can think about is exploring partnerships that make it easier for us to implement upskilling and reskilling programs at scale. And there's some really good examples out there. Actually, Waste Management just announced they're doing some work with Guild Education. There's companies like Degreed, Coursera, and even Open Sesame here as well that have got good programs that we can be leaning into that can really help address the upskill, reskill challenge at scale. Very turnkey, very targeted, very well done things that can help us. I think the trick, though, is avoiding the trap of more is better. So it's not about having 10,000 titles that, and a big catalog in your LMS. It's really now about having focus on clearly articulated learning paths and even credentials, if you can get it, specifically targeted at where those upskill opportunities are needed in the organization or those reskill opportunities are needed in your organization as well. So it's not only about having more and having breadth, but it's also being smart about that breadth and how you position it in your organization and how well that aligns against what the business challenge is in terms of where people are looking for talent in the organization but can't find it. And a great way to do that is to actively engage with your talent acquisition organization. Reach out to those peers. And then while that's not a traditional path for most of us, right? You think about that group over there that does the hiring and we do the training kind of piece. That cross collaboration here can be really important, particularly in knowing where they're challenged to find people, what they're looking for in people when they're filling jobs, can be a real great informant into your upskilling strategy and then what programs and practices you prioritize to help people upskill in the organization. So thinking about those things becomes really important. So at a higher level, stepping back for a second on all of these pieces that I just talked about, overall, we can see the landscape shifting from, the near-term pandemic strategies that we had to now being really asked to reinvent our learning strategies for the longer haul and what we can see on the horizon, right? We know there's still uncertainty out here around like, what does hybrid work really mean and how is that going to continue to evolve? But people are stepping back and saying, so what is the learning strategy now post-pandemic? And that requires a bit of reinvention and rethinking and broadening in terms of the way we go. I think there's an expectation on the landscape as well to move from reactive solutions, and you'll hear that in the context of people saying, learning and development is traditionally an order taker, to really moving to anticipating organizational needs. So that's that partnership with talent acquisition is a good example of where you can anticipate organizational needs by knowing what jobs are hard to fill and by knowing what opportunities are available inside the organization to help upskill people to take those opportunities. I mentioned this one, going from large volumes of content to carefully curated learning paths. I think curated is really important. So curated meaning it's current, and two, making sure that it's right on target in terms of what people are looking for and what's really important to the business to drive it forward. This fourth one I talk about a lot, and that's like from being creators of learning experiences to sort of product managers and product creators. To really moving to enabling learning experiences. I think as you look at workplace collaboration tools like Slack and Teams and all these others, they're really learning tools. So how do we expand beyond the thinking of, we define ourselves in the context of the courses and the content that we deliver, and how do we think more about being enablers of organizational learning, even if that means learning from other people that have nothing to do with the L&D organization. So how do you, as an L&D professional, unlock that capability for people to learn from each other, for example? And how do we shift from that as opposed to our traditional model? I think that that's an expectation that's coming and is showing up in organizations now as we're going. And then the last one, I'll say, that the definition of e-learning virtual in a classroom as, is what we call blended to really, what a true hybrid is. And that can be, a whole lot of other things beyond just those sort of three pillars that we've sort of defined before as our blended solution model. So we're really being challenged on those things to think about as we go forward. And a couple things to think about relative to the business model. So I'll close with where I started on this business model, infrastructure, and content. But I think that, on the business model side, we should really take a clean sheet to our learning and development strategy and structure. Does the model we have in place make sense? It made sense in a pre-pandemic world. Does it make sense in a post-pandemic world? Just a real question. And I heard somebody else talk about, clean sheeting the learning and development function. And as an L&D leader or whatever your role is, how do you clean sheet the work you do and really say what makes the most sense as we go forward? And if you shift your organization from creator to enabler, how does that affect the skills that you need? And the resources that you need in L&D and the role you play in L&D. I think the other piece is, things to think about on the business model side is speaking to stakeholders and identify ways to best support the business strategy as you go forward. Gut check with them about how their expectations may have changed and or how they think you might be, delivering more value by structuring and or strategically driving your L&D function a little bit different. And then I think the last piece is consider a balance of approach of internal and external expertise that can enable you to move faster and be more agile. Not to shamelessly plug Open Sesame, but Open Sesame was a great example for me at McDonald's where, the external partnerships that we had enabled us to really turnkey some really pivotal and important content to a large population for us, in a week or two. Where if we tried to do all that internally, we never would have been able to do it. So thinking about that internal, external approach is really important as you go forward. That's really going to help you be a lot more agile as you move the business forward as well. So let's talk about infrastructure for a second. I think that, these are sort of big fundamental questions that we should talk about, like, how are they impacting and disrupting your infrastructure? So what are the implications of Viva if it comes out next year and your IT organization is a big Microsoft shop? You should probably think about what the question is. You should probably go out and engage your IT organization in that conversation, and at least begin exploring it, because it's better to be in control of it than to have it done to you. And I think that those are the things that you need to do. But on the other pieces are really around the changes in the classroom, and then really, if you have trainers, what's the longer term implications for their roles? Do they move to sort of being multifaceted or multi-skilled kind of facilitators? So regardless of the delivery method, they're capable of making it happen for you. Those are some big questions to think about on your infrastructure side, and what does all that mean as you go forward? And then the last piece, so I keep us on time, is around content. And thinking about how are you supporting these expanded conversations that we're now having around DEI&B, well-being, and other needs. How are you supporting that with targeted content? Traditionally, those areas were very hard to make a business case for. But if you look at your organization's business strategies these days, and business focus and the conversations in the C-suite, these are the things that are getting talked about a lot. Right? How do we make sure our employees' well-being is taken care of? How do we make sure we're creating an environment where DE and IB are alive and real and visible to everyone in the organization? So those are typically softer business cases, but right now L&D can play a really critical role in supporting content and supporting messaging with content and helping bring that forward, probably like never before. And then, the curation process is always key as well. So how do you make sure things stay current? How do you make sure they stay relevant? How do you make sure they're being consumed? And if they're not, how do you shut them down? Again, that basic sort of catalog management idea of how do you make sure what's in there is relevant and what's in there is right. The learning paths piece I talked about a lot, so I'll skip that. But your buy build strategy for content, and how do you think about that on the content side? Again, is that internal external partnership piece that's really critical to agility, not only on innovation in terms of different thinking, but also ready access to really relevant content as well. And then the last piece on content is how do you make sure you've got a good feedback loop? So how do you make sure that you know what's working and what's not, what people find valuable and what's not, and beyond the consumption metrics? How do you really know that people find it relevant, useful, and impactful to their performance as employees in the business? So those are my sort of things to think about that I think are pushing on all of us as L&D professionals right now, making it probably more challenging than ever. Yet at the same time, I think giving us the greatest opportunity I've seen in almost 30 years in this space to really become, front seat business drivers in our organizations. So thank you with that. And I think that Stuart and I are now going to have a great conversation from here.
Yeah, awesome, Rob. Thank you so much for all that insight. There were lots of questions coming up in the live stream. So let's see if I can pick a couple of those. Molly asks, what skills would you recommend for facilitators that are conducting training with participants in the room and other participants who are remote? It's a great question. You referenced kind of that improving your skills. What skills do they need?
Yeah, to nail it down to a skill, I think it's still down to facilitating, right? So I think that if you know how to facilitate in a room, you'll probably be able to do it in a hybrid environment as well. But for me, it's two things. I think it's what tools are available to help make that easier for you, right? So how do you identify some tools where, for example, how do you do a breakout session where you've got, you pair people up, which is a traditional model you find in learning. How are you going to do that in a hybrid environment? Thinking about how do you do that and make that easy for the learner and easy for yourself as a facilitator, I think is a really important first step. And then I think the second one is really about thinking about ways you can ensure that engagement feels the same, right? So if I'm online, how does it feel like I'm in the classroom or I'm valued as much as someone who happens to be in the room with everyone else? I think that's a really important piece. And then conversely, if I'm sitting in the classroom, how do I make sure that my experience isn't being compromised because there's people that are remote?
Yeah.
And I think as the facilitator, that's the kind of focus areas I would say, and where, I'd say sharpen the saw from a skills perspective, to make sure that that's going to be a great experience for everybody involved, and that you can do that easily without, sort of getting yourself cognitively bogged down with process.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. One of the other things I've heard over the last year is to try to make sure everyone comes to the session with a common set of understandings and definitions through either pre-work or advanced online learning, so that the session itself is much more interactive and dialogue based versus just teaching.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think level setting is critically important for people in the room. Yeah.
Awesome. And actually, another question. It's funny that you referenced tools. Someone asked about Scale. They couldn't find it. Maybe they have a funky URL.
Yeah. SKALE is the name of the company. So, and if they want to shoot a note to me, I'll be happy to point them to a URL. So.
Awesome. Great. Let's see. Susan had a really interesting question as well. So what are the challenges instructional designers are facing that explains why they are not meeting companies' needs for training and development? What can we do as instructional designers to better meet those challenges and improve, right? Your survey data was fascinating.
Yeah, around that piece.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the decline in satisfaction with learning and development, right?
Yeah. I think that there's I looked at that one and I was like, oof, and it's interesting because the report didn't talk about it at all. It talked about sort of other things it expected to be worse, right? And overall satisfaction ticked up, which was probably made it even worse. But I'm looking at it from an L&D lens and sitting there saying, oof, we're at the bottom of the list. That's not necessarily good. And right. I do think that expectations are rising. I think from an instructional design perspective, I think that there's some emerging trends that need to be thought about, particularly in terms of workflow-based learning, and sort of leveraging modalities where you can meet people where they are, more than sort of removing them from the environment into a different environment to complete some coursework, right? So I think that as an instructional designer, really spending the time to understand the environment of the person you're trying to serve becomes really important, and understanding how they actually learn as opposed to how you want them to learn is probably a critical shift that has to take place, in the organization and in most organizations today. And I've seen, I'm working with a company that does text-based learning, and it's like, text messaging is like so ubiquitous. It's like, why wasn't somebody doing this years ago? And I'm sitting there saying, I'm not at McDonald's anymore, but why the heck wasn't I doing that? Because I think, as an instructional designer, my roots are in instructional design, and I'm sitting there like, God, that's so obvious. I can think of like 15 reasons or 15 ways I should have been doing it, but wasn't doing it. So I think, on the instructional design side, it really is thinking about like, don't constrain yourself to necessarily the use case and the tools that you have in front of you today. Think about the other ones that might be available. So be actively curious, I think, is a way to think about it, about what new stuff is out there to be able to use and experiment with. And then second, really take the time to understand your learner and how they're actually learning to do what it is that you think that you're conveying to them.
Yeah, bring learning into the flow of work, right?
Yeah, and that's such an overused term, so I try to avoid it, but because and it also means a lot of different things to people. So, but yeah, I think I've always been a proponent of look for ways to eliminate the need for training. You can spend an entire career as an L&D professional doing that and probably be wildly successful. But that gets you to things like workplace, workflow learning, or better systems design, or those types of things where you can really drive a lot of value that are beyond the realm of instructional design kind of tradition, but really can be hugely incrementally valuable in an organization and make you more valuable, frankly.
Yeah, excellent. I really enjoyed your conference board slide and the alignment of CHROs and CEOs. So maybe you can talk to the audience about how you built alignment with
from a learning and development perspective with the rest of your peers on the senior leadership team?
Yeah, I think that it's a two-way street, I would say. So part of it is, having a clearly articulated strategy for where you want to take the learning and development organization and what you want to stand for and what you want to be about is like important. And I think that's what people expect from you as an L&D leader in the organization. And I don't think it matters what level you're at too. So, even an instructional designer in the audience here can know and should be able to articulate where they're trying to go as a learning and development function, or where they're trying to go with instructional design perspective. At least from philosophical, this is the direction that I'm striving for. So I think that's really important, but that has to be informed too about where the business is and where the business is trying to go. So thinking about, I can think about my experiences at McDonald's and Yum Brands and even Singular Wireless when I was there in the early 2000s. There's always a lot of cutting edge stuff out there. And the organization is not necessarily always ready to embrace it. So thinking about virtual reality is a simple example. I'd probably be thinking about it differently now than I did, last year or 2 years ago, or definitely 5 years ago. But, I experimented with Google Glass when I was at Yum Brands in 2012, 2013 to see if people could make chicken at KFC. And I think that, the experiment said, yeah, it can be done, but no, we're not ready for it as an organization. There's still too many other things, barriers in the way, like bandwidth and expense and those types of pieces. The net gain wasn't really worth the business case, kind of things. So I think that, the C-level organization expects you to walk that balance. So you should be paying attention to the shiny objects. You shouldn't necessarily be chasing them unless your organization's ready for them. Or, your organization has a tolerance for experimentation in terms of where you go. And where I was in an organization, not to say they didn't have a tolerance for experimentation, but experimentation at scale is not necessarily a good thing in large organizations. So thinking about the pockets and where you can innovate, I think that strategy, is what people are expecting, forward progress that's aligned with where the business is trying to go, and that your strategy, you can point to your strategy and say, here's how it lines up exactly to what we're trying to do as a business.
Awesome. And it's funny, even more questions are coming in around skill development for facilitators. So we'll have to think about running a future session on that.
Yeah.
So that's super interesting. But maybe to end, maybe you can share your thoughts on this new normal hybrid work environment. George asked a question that I'm adapting a little bit around. How are budgets changing now for learning and development, given post-pandemic in this hybrid environment and this enormous need for upskilling and reskilling? What are you seeing? What advice do you have to L&D professionals?
Yeah, I think that there's some fundamental tenets that I think don't change. So having been around for the dot-com boom, around for the 2007 financial crisis, around for 9/11, and then around for the pandemic. It's been interesting this time because actually there's been a lean into learning and development, where in some of those in the past, the economy restricted so much that a lot of learning and development budgets got cut. So the credit, I think, goes to organizational leaders who recognize the importance of learning, probably at a higher level than maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, right? We think about it differently. We understand the importance of it as senior leaders in the organization. So all of that leads to so at a tactical level, the budget conversation is, if you can prove value for what you're doing and show how it's aligned to the business, there has never been a moment in my career where I couldn't get funding. I can think back to my Singular days, and we were not doing really well in one particular year. And I was able to get $1.5 million of incremental funding because I was able to show that a training program we put together generated about $40 million worth of incremental revenue. So I think that, if you're able to walk in with that kind of conversation, the money is always there. Because the budgeting process is really about prioritization of the organization's resources against strategy. And if you can show that your learning and development efforts are aligned and organized against strategy, you're probably going to get funded. right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't think that changes in a post-pandemic world. If anything, I think that the expectation is now that, of course, that's what you're going to be doing. And if you're doing something else, you're just going to disappoint me as a senior leader. And maybe the budget's not going to get cut, but you might have to be in the role for very long. So, unfortunately.
Yeah, those last comments really warm my heart around money follows value, right?
100%. Always has, always will. It doesn't matter the circumstance of the surroundings around you. It's like virtual reality. I mean, Walmart was investing in virtual reality prior to the pandemic. They probably felt like they were geniuses when the pandemic broke out, right? But they were experimenting. When the pandemic came, what happened was they leaned into it, right? And said, okay, we have to go this way now. Well, where did all that money come from? And where did that incremental funding come from? Because I'm pretty sure it happened in the middle of the year. So I'm guessing that it probably wasn't planned in a budget somewhere, right? Someone stepped forward with a case and said, look, this is really the future, part of the future of where we're going to go. And we need to make this investment. And it was tied to a business strategy that people could get their head around, and the money was available.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We have a much more fertile ground, right? I mean, I think as I listen to your answer, and so if we do a good job planting the seeds and watering and fertilizing them and showing the value that we can deliver as L&D professionals, money will follow that.
Yeah, and to that end, I think like my advice to anybody, that's sort of a C-level conversation. But, if you're an instructional designer, if you can talk the language of business first, and instructional design, like in the room with the other instructional designers, you're going to win all day, right? Yeah. People will value you, and you'll have more work than you know what to do with, which you'll feel overwhelmed on, but it's also a measure that you're being really successful. So, I think that's sort of the way to frame it up.
So awesome. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Really happy to be here.
Yeah, super insightful. But I think we have to call it there. For sure, we'd love to have you back in the future as well. So thanks for joining us.
All right. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, Rob Lauber. It is a pleasure, and we so appreciate your time and insights, and we hope you can join us again. So thanks to everyone here for joining us for our 4th Learning Unlock session for 2021. We have a lot more to come this month, so please be sure to stay tuned for additional sessions every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific time, I think in June. Next up, this coming Tuesday, we have Harvard Business Publishing's Abby Lewis and Ryan Kerr, who will share practical tips for how your organization can embrace digital intelligence and foster this crucial new skill set. We'll drop the link in the chat so you can join us. We also want to give a big shout out to all of our incredible sponsors who have made the sessions we've already had and the ones coming up possible. We're super appreciative of your support of this event. And a final reminder to everyone here, you will receive today's slides and a recording via email. So please be on the lookout for that, and please share it with your friends and colleagues. I hope you enjoyed today's session. Take care and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.